Welcome to Ministries the Podcast, where I talk to successful ministry leaders about how they're using podcasting to amplify their mission and grow their ministry so you can too. I'm Tim Hull, your host and owner of Sonomorphic, a podcast production company that specializes in podcasting for ministries. My guest today is Angie Elkins. She's the manager of the Lifeway podcast network and host of Let It Shine with Angie Elkins. Angie and I are going to talk about what made her want to start a podcast back in 2017, her most successful strategies for growing a podcast audience, and her favorite podcast mic to recommend. And it happens to be under $100. So let's get to it. Here's my conversation with Angie Elkins. Well, Angie, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
You are so welcome. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, so I first heard about your podcast through my wife, and she's an avid That Sounds Fun podcast listener. And so she actually came across your episode in a big list that Annie F. Downs put together, similar to the episode that I did before with Jeff Pitts. He was also on that list. But your episode is number 4 on that list. And basically, she had asked for recommendations from her audience of, hey, what podcast should I be listening to that you, my audience, also create? And so I wanted to have you on the podcast to hear about your journey and how that exposure from that list, one, helped with that episode, but how that's been for the podcast and the work that you get to do as a whole. So let's start there. Have you noticed a significant bump in listeners from just being on that list and being so close to the top?
Actually, no.
No? Okay.
You know, when I knew you were going to ask me this question, so I went back to look and I was like, oh my gosh, I should pay more attention and see. So the episode we're referring to, for people who might want to know, I'm sure you'll link it in the show notes. It was an episode on entitlement with Lisa Whittle as my co-host, where we talked about that, unpacked that idea around entitlement. And it is one of my higher listened to shows already.
Gotcha.
But I think since that list came out, I didn't see a huge bump.
Gotcha.
I mean, it's definitely being listened to every day, but I never saw quite a spike or anything like that. Yeah.
That's a cool part about Spotify, right? That you can actually create playlists and include podcasts in them. So people, I'm sure down the road, as Annie references that, will continue to scroll through that list and hit play on episodes like yours. And so did Annie listen to the episode and give you feedback like she had put in the message? I'm guessing she did, but yeah, what'd she say?
She did. She said, I got to listen to your episode today with Lisa Whittle. How is she just the smartest, most profound? Sheesh. Thank you so much for sharing this episode with me. Your show is awesome. It matters to so many people, and it really is meeting people where they are. Absolutely love it. So it was sweet.
Nice.
Annie has always been super encouraging to me. I've met her a couple of times.
Nice. Yeah.
She always remembers, you know, when people like Annie meet so many people.
Yeah.
And so I never expect her. We're not like friends. We don't text or anything like that, but we do know each other. And she's just always been so gracious and encouraging. And we have some crossover friends, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So she's wonderful.
That's great. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So as we record this episode, you just released episode 37 with Jenny Allen, but that episode number does not nearly adequately reflect your experience in podcasting. And that's because you actually started a podcast and did that for 250 episodes before you rebranded and started the episode number over again. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But I would love to go back to 2017, where you began your podcasting journey. What made you want to start a podcast?
Tim, I love telling the story. I, first and foremost, was a podcast listener. I think as many of us who got into podcasts, we were listening and loving it. I happened to be at the same time in my life really looking for kind of a new ministry outlet. I actually went to seminary. I have a seminary degree, and it was my dream job was to serve in the local church. And my husband is actually a worship pastor.
Yeah.
He's the worship pastor at our church. But I also have my music degree. And so the only way really I could serve in that capacity would be to be on his team. And we're in a very established church, and there's just a lot of rules around husbands and wives working together in the same department. So when I realized I'm not going to be able to do ministry in the way that I thought I was, I really just prayed and said, God, I want to do ministry. And he just said, then you can do it. I mean, there's nobody stopping you from doing ministry.
Yeah.
It just might look a little bit different than what you thought. And so as I began to find podcasts, Jamie Ivy's podcast was the very first show I found in the genre, I guess, religion, spirituality genre that I was listening to, the Happy Hour with Jamie. I loved it. I was binge listening to it, as we all do when we find a show we love. I was listening. I can remember the moments I was driving down I-4 here in Orlando and some of the conversations that I heard and how inspired I was by these stories women were telling about God and how he was moving in their lives. And I was sitting in the Publix parking lot. I couldn't get out to go in and do my grocery shopping because I was so riveted to these conversations. And I just started thinking, could I start curating these kinds of conversations myself? Could this be a ministry outlet for me? One of the other things I was so inspired by with Jamie in particular is that she was just a regular mom like me who figured it out. And I thought, okay, if she can figure this out, I can figure it out. I believe in my ability to figure things out. Okay. I was not techie in any way. I did not know a single thing about podcasts. I didn't know how it got from your computer where you would record it to the interwebs, like literally nothing. I knew nothing. My husband is techie. He's a worship pastor. He runs Ableton. He does all of those things. Yeah. And I knew that if I got in a bind, I could fall back on him. But there was part of me that really wanted to learn it myself. I decided I would start my show. And honestly, it was a desire to create a ministry that I could maintain. But it also was, I wanted my job to be podcasting. My original goal was to monetize my show. I gave myself a 2-year deadline and said, I'm going to release a show every single week for 2 years and turn it into my job. And so that's kind of the beginning and how I decided to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's some dedication and forethought to be like, okay, I know this is going to take some time. I'm going to put the time and effort into it. And so I'm curious now that you say that, did that plan come to fruition in the 2-year mark?
Well, about 18 months in, and let me tell you, the 2-year mark, the reason I chose 2 years was because I had a son who was a sophomore in high school and going to college in 2 years. And that was the kind of the financial marker moment for me where I thought I've really got to start contributing in a significant way to this household income. About 18 months into my journey, I realized that I probably could monetize maybe part-time, like it would be maybe a part-time job. But in order for me to make the kind of money I needed to make, I needed to figure out a different way to make money in podcasting. And so by that time in my journey, I had begun developing relationships with authors and people who were sort of podcast adjacent, you know, right around that time. So like we're talking 2018-ish, there were a lot of publishers were putting a lot of pressure on their authors to start podcasts, and they were all happy to be podcasters, but none of them wanted to do the behind the scenes work to podcasting. And you know, there's quite a bit of work that goes into that. Well, I had started my own show, but I'm going to be real honest with you, Tim. At that point, I was watching the YouTube videos. I was checking the box. I didn't know why this connected to this in a certain way. I had no idea what I was doing, but I was just doing what I was told, following a checklist. Yeah. But I thought, I've done it once. I could do it for someone else. So I just put it out there in an author group that I was in that said, hey, if any of you need any help starting a podcast, if you'll hire me, I won't charge you much money at all, and I'll help you start it. I know how to do it. And I had one person. Her name was Jen Hand. Her show, to this day, I'll still tell everybody about her show. Her show has rebranded. It's called My Yes is on the Table now. It started with a different name, but now it's called My Yes is on the Table. She's awesome. Y'all should all go listen to her show. She's wonderful and fantastic. She said yes to me. I charged her a very minimal amount to edit her show because I did not know what I was doing. I was literally learning on her dime. She told someone else about me who told someone else about me. And that is really how it started to grow for me. So by the time, I guess I would say 2020 rolled around, I was probably making a full-time income editing just with my own business. But really the break came for me with some friends of mine, Beth and Jeff McCord, who run Your Enneagram Coach, if you guys know, and people love the Enneagram. And I kept telling them, you guys need a podcast. You have got to start a podcast. Why are you not in the podcast game? And so when they got ready, they reached out to me and said, we want to start a podcast and we want you to help us. So That was in 2020 because it was right before COVID hit. So perfect timing to get in the podcast game for sure.
Yeah.
Their show hit 1 million downloads in the first year. And that's not because of me. That's because of them and their topic. That's where I really learned to chop the onions fast on that show. That editing experience for me, they would say, hey, we're going to have 6 guests on the show. And of course, they're all on different tracks. And I was still editing on GarageBand. Yeah. So it was crazy those days. Upgraded to Logic Pro during that time period, though. But they were awesome. And that show also was really good for me because they let me bring my kind of creative producer brain into that environment, which I was sort of doing that with my clients prior to that. But they all really had a really good idea around maybe their book or what they were trying to promote on their show. But for Beth and Jeff, they just knew we want to talk about the Enneagram. And so I got to step into the producer role there and really help them create the shows and create the content. I'll cut my teeth there with them as well. So yeah. And then they decided to move to full video on their podcast. And I'm not a video editor. They did come to me and say, hey, we will send you to school to learn to edit video if you want to do it. And I was like, I don't want to do that. So they said, okay, we're going to hire a video editor. Well, when they hired a video editor, they hired the Mercedes-Benz of video editors. He was, he's this great guy named Jeff McCullough who'd had a lot of experience and success on YouTube. And they hired him to come in. And I realized they don't need me. They don't know this yet, but they don't need me. So Jeff was awesome to work with. And, I stayed at Your Enneagram Coach just a little bit longer. But right about that time, full circle moment, Jamie Ivey was looking for someone to help her start a network. And they reached out to me.
I was going to ask you about that because you had been publishing your podcast. And now I know too that you were doing some production for some other folks as well for about 5 years. Right. And then you were hired on with JV Ivey's media company, Ivey Media, to be their manager of podcasts. And so I'd love to hear, what was it like to go from, okay, you're doing your own show and you're producing some other podcasts to now overseeing, I think it was 8 shows that were on the network there. What was that like?
It was so much fun. And also just working on that team was an absolute dream for me. As I mentioned earlier, Jamie was my inspiration for starting the podcast. Yeah. And so the fact that she would bring me on her team and give me access to her show and to her brain and just to all that she was doing was the biggest honor for me. I mean, I think the first time I went to Austin to work with the team, I cried multiple times because I just couldn't believe it was happening. So that was a dream, but also I love making other people's podcast dreams come true. I love being a podcaster for sure. And I actually think it makes me better at what I do. But listening to other women specifically dream about what they want to do and what they want to put out into the world and having them look to me for advice and to help sculpt that or give them just direction on it, it's my favorite thing in the world. So I loved working with the other women on her network, and just the stuff that we were able to create together was fantastic.
Nice. Yeah. So you were at that role for about a year. From there, you transitioned to the role that you currently are doing with Lifeway on their podcast network as the manager of Lifeway Podcast Network. And so I'd love to know too, you started with your own show, then you added some additional shows that you were helping produce, and then you were hired on to manage the network with Jamie Ivey, and then you go to Lifeway and now you're overseeing even more shows. What have you taken or built upon as you're going through all of those different roles that you've brought you to today?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a crazy story because, as you know, when I started podcasting, I knew nothing. I'm a mom who lives in Orlando, Florida. And so I'll tell this part of the story really quick because I think your listeners will resonate with it. As you know, I was freelancing before I went to work for Jamie. And during that time period in 2021, January of 21, I was sort of praying through what is my next direction? What next steps do I need to take in order to just grow this business or grow spiritually or whatever? And one of the questions that I kept getting asked by people in the podcast world was, how do you start a podcast? Is the basic questions. Yeah. And you know it. How many times have people asked you, Tim, hey, can I pick your brain? So many, yeah. Yes. And so I was getting that a lot. And people finally started saying to me, you need to create a course That's what you need to do. And so 2021, I'll never forget, I was walking in my neighborhood with my friend Adair, and I was telling her, I think God's telling me I need to just go ahead and pull the trigger on the course. And I was a little bit, I don't know, not excited about it because it felt so big and hard to me. I'm a bootstrapping girl. I'm not like all the big amazing lights and professional. I know how to do this. I've literally learned on GarageBand and taught myself from there. And so it felt too big. But I thought, you know what? The easiest way for me to do this is I'm just going to teach a course live on Zoom. I'm just going to ask people who want to take this course to do it. I'll record it. It's not going to be edited. It's not going to be polished. It's just going to be me helping you figure it out. And I put it out there that year, and I had probably 30 people take my course from the top. And then the second time I took the course, there was a friend that I'd met in the SBC who worked at Lifeway, who said, I need help starting a show at Lifeway. And so I was honored. I was like, oh my gosh, a show at Lifeway is going to learn from me. Like, I just couldn't believe it. It turned out it was the president of Lifeway's show, and they hired me to edit that show. Here I am, mom in Orlando, editing the president of Lifeway's show. I literally could not believe it. I was like, who but God? Who but God could do this? So I got in there, and not only that, but I just really clicked with Ben Mandrell and his wife, Lindley, who host that show, and became the producer and editor of that show. And then eventually Ben really talked me into coming on the team at Lifeway to run all of the shows. I had to transition out of Jamie's team to do that, but I love Lifeway. I've been a big fan. I've been a big user of all their products for my whole life. And so it was really kind of a no-brainer. Yeah. So you asked me what I've learned. Gosh, I feel like everything I've learned is probably, if I were to stack it up, it's still not past the things I'm still yet to learn, if that makes sense. Like, you understand this, Tim. The podcast world changes so much. It's ever evolving. And so I think probably the biggest lesson I've learned right now is that experimenting in podcast world is everything, trying it to see if it works. I used to be so afraid of that. I used to think there was a right way and a wrong way. And obviously there are best practices, but being willing to just say, hey, let's try this and see if it works, and we can always change it, has been such a huge lesson for me. Yeah.
What are some examples of that you've tried things and either they worked or you found out maybe that's not the right direction to go?
Well, I mean, probably the biggest and most obvious is the rebranding of my show. And you mentioned this at the top. It's not that my show didn't work. But I was ready for a change. I would even say it had stopped working in some ways. I think the audience was still listening, but it had stopped growing. And it wasn't working for me. So what I was doing before was just straight interview format. I was getting pitches from publishers about authors, and I would think, oh, that sounds good. And I would schedule them to interview. And by the time I got to their interview, I was not interested in the topic anymore, or I was just uninspired, or I had so much going on because I was running a business on the side. Not on the side. I was running another business. I had lost my focus, I would say. I had lost my inspiration around it. I'd lost my joy in it. And I considered quitting. Even when I moved to Ivy Media, I thought this might be the moment where I step away from podcasting just to focus on everyone else. But I just couldn't bring myself to do it. Quitting is hard for me. I'm just like, that's just a thing. I have to really know it's what God is telling me to do to quit. By the time I started moving to Lifeway, I started getting a new, fresh vision for the show and decided to rebrand. So I would say that's probably the best example of something that maybe wasn't working, that I tried something new.
So let's talk about that for a minute. The show was originally called Chatology, and you'd published episodes for several years, 250 episodes. And then, around the same time that you transitioned to Lifeway, you rebranded the show to what it's called now, which is Let It Shine. You shared a little bit of that story. How did that transition, it seemed like it somewhat correlated with that transition to Lifeway. Talk about that a little bit more.
I would say the change in me started before I knew I was going to Lifeway. So this is kind of a whole different topic, but God really started working in my life through just a desire to get healthy. That's the way I'm going to put it. I had just reached a point in my life where physically I was feeling terrible. I had gained a lot of weight. I think coming out of COVID, a lot of us did. And I was just not in a good place. And I decided to do a challenge called 75 Hard. I'm sure many of you have heard of it. Yeah. So I did it really just to challenge myself physically. And as I got into the challenge, I learned it was way more than a physical challenge. It was a mental and for me, a spiritual challenge. And so God started working. It was like the conduit for him to speak to me in that hard space. And I think that's one of the things we learn, when you push yourself to do hard things or when hard things happen to us, God speaks, right? He speaks loudly.
Yep.
And so I felt like he was just saying, this whole experience that you're having is not about your outward body. It's about what's going on inside of you. And so I really started thinking about inspiring my listeners to have a whole body, mind, and spirit connection, but not just that, to seek spiritual growth. And as I was even listening to podcasts as I was out walking, I would listen to sort of self-helpy things and think, there's a gap here. Like Christians, we are called to be sanctified and always pursuing growth in our spiritual lives, but we're not. It's like we are getting by every day, just doing the best we can. We're surviving. Nobody is thriving, and I felt the call in my life to really pursue sanctification over self-help. And so that was kind of the birth of this new idea. And every day as I would go out and walk, I was getting like episode ideas and I'm just jotting them down in my notes as I'm walking, That's really where the rebirth of the show came. It came through my own kind of spiritual growth experience.
Nice. Yeah. And a part of that, as I listened to a few episodes, you talked about how then you were also going to shift the way that you're doing the show a little bit so that you now have 4 co-hosts that you call the Illuminators.
That's right.
And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. What made you decide to have several other consistent voices on the podcast?
So part of it was that burnout that I had with interviews. And I would say actually that's a main part of it. And because I felt like I had a lot to say. And what I was finding in my other show on Chatology was that my role really was to be a curator of the conversation. And there were times that I would definitely talk about what God was doing in my life and all of that. But for the most part, I felt like I was just an interviewer and I wasn't getting to say the things that I wanted to say. And so I thought, well, how could I do that? And the shows I was enjoying at the time were conversations. They weren't so much question interview, although I do love that format, which by the way, have you listened to Wiser Than Me? That's like literally one of my favorite things. Oh, well, it's not a Christian show, so warning, but it's Julia Louis-Dreyfus' show, and she only interviews women who are older than 70, and it is so good.
That's a great idea, man.
It's so good. All that to say, I really wanted to have conversations with my friends. That was basically it. And so I picked 4 people who I knew that I would look to for inspiration on my own sanctification and growth and asked them to be illuminators on the show. And then we picked topics and recorded them. And I can get into the weeds of like the production and how we did it if you want, but yeah, so that was it. And it was a much more enjoyable experience for me. It really allowed me to sort of consolidate the way that I was thinking about my show with batch. We recorded in batch. And so I was able to completely focus instead of like picking up and recording every week and having to get recentered and figure out where I was going. So yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you record in the Lifeway studio, and you said you record in batch. So are you having all those 4 co-hosts come at the same time, and you just kind of run through a list, or is it just like, hey, I'm going to record this many episodes with this person, and we're going to do that at this date? What does that look like?
Yeah. So as you know, as I said earlier, I had a long list of episode ideas. And so as I picked my 4 illuminators, I communicated with them separately and I would say, hey, here are some topics that I think you specifically, like there was a reason I picked you, like Lindley Mandrell, for example. She was one of my illuminators. She is someone who inspires me. She's always pursuing to be better in her life. And she's very organized. She's very methodical. She's very repetitive. And so some of the topics that I picked that I knew she could speak to like easily without having to put a lot of effort into, I sent her like 6 topics that were connected to that. And she shot back and she was like, how about these 4? That's how we decided on the topics she would discuss. Then I scheduled a date in the studio with her. So all of my episodes are 20 to 30 minutes. And we just blocked, 4 hours in the studio. She came in. We would sit and brainstorm the topic for about 15 minutes together. And she already had things that she knew she wanted to bring to the conversation. So did I. Yeah. We kind of talked through a flow, but we didn't get super detailed. And then we just hit record and just let it go. And then we would, at the end of that episode, we'd take a quick break, refresh. Yeah. We would look at the next topic and do the same thing. So we just did 4 in a row like that. And then I did that with each one of my illuminators. So scheduled a day in the studio with them, all of the same. Yeah. I released them in a rotation. So it was like Lindley's episode would come out, then Whitney's would come out the next week, then Lisa's the next week, and then Tiffany's the next week. And so the audience, the listeners were getting a great variety. We were staying on topic. And then within a matter of 4 days, I had recorded my entire season, minus the interviews. Now, I didn't want to completely get rid of interviews. Yeah. There were still people I wanted to talk to on the topics. So I would schedule those out every other week or 2 a month or, in some way like that. So I still had that kind of sprinkled into the show.
Yeah. So how has the audience responded to that? So this is one of the things that kind of behind the scenes, right? You had a show going. This was the format. This is what people subscribe to, right? And then you switch it up a little bit. How has that been? I believe you were saying before that it's been positive. What does that look like?
Well, it's growing. I feel like with Chatology, I'd plateaued and was even in the red a little bit, on the on the Apple stats. I was a little bit in the red, like net followers. It's growing now, so I'm thankful for that. It's not I wouldn't say there's a huge spike, but it's steady growth, which is great for me. That's my goal. So they have responded. I am seeing more of a response in, my Instagram DMs, people listening, those kinds of things. Also, at the beginning of the year, I did a New Year's challenge, and there was a huge response to that. We started a WhatsApp group, where we were in there together. And so that was really fun. It's the first time I'd ever really done a community sort of situation. So, yeah.
That's cool. What would you say is the advantage of producing your own podcast alongside managing the shows at Lifeway?
Yeah. I mean, it definitely kind of keeps me sharp and really knowing what the challenges are. If I'm recording on Riverside and I'm having issues, I know the rest of my podcasters are having issues, and so I can address that before they even question it, or it makes me a little more curious about things. So I may be deep diving something on my show, and along the way, I stumble across something that's going to help them as well. Yeah. So that happens often, or vice versa. I'm looking up a problem for them, and then I find, I actually could benefit from this. It helps me getting pitches. As I get pitches for shows, it might not be a right or a good fit for me, but it is for someone else in the network. And so, there's a lot of great things about it.
Nice. Yeah. So now that you've been podcasting for about 7 years, how has it helped you amplify your mission and grow your ministry?
It's so good. Well, it depends on what you mean by grow, right? And this is one of the things I always tell podcasters, like when you're starting your show, define what success is for you from the very beginning. And, for me, when I started Chatology in 2017, success was monetization. That was what my goal was. Yes, I was looking for a ministry platform, but I wanted to monetize. And I realized about 18 months in that I was going to need to shift that. So don't be so held on to what you think your goal is that you can't pivot, you know? Yeah. I am a podcaster, but my job as the manager of the podcast network at Lifeway, that's what my ministry is. Yeah. Right. And so it's expanded far beyond what I could have ever dreamed. Like if you were to add up the number of listeners that we have at Lifeway and think that in some way what I'm doing is impacting all of those people across the world, I could have never dreamed. And it's so much bigger than I would have ever reached with my own show on its own. And so I think the lesson for me was just being willing to hold my plans loosely so that God could do whatever he wanted to do with what he had been teaching
Yeah.
me about podcasting.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. So I'd love to get into some of the technical and production side of things here. What would be your advice for people that are interested in growing their podcast audience? What have you found to be the best way to do that?
The number one thing I always say to grow your audience, and listen, Tim, this is not going to be a surprise to you and probably not to any of your listeners, but this is what I say. It's just to have amazing shareable content. I mean, I know it's not a secret. It's not some kind of turnkey thing that you can just check a box, but that is it. Word of mouth and people saying, hey, you would love this show is the best way to grow your show. And so you want to create content that's going to make people want to share it. Also, ask people to share it. People do not do that. They're afraid. And ask on the show. So when you're recording, ask, but also send it to 10 of your friends and say, hey, will you send this to someone who you know would love it? Or even the people that you know are listening faithfully. I have a handful of those people who always respond to me and say, oh my gosh, great show this week. And I almost always in return say, hey, did you think of somebody that would like it? Please share it with them. And that is the call to action I give on almost every episode is, and I believe that this is not manipulative. I really, truly believe this. When I'm listening to podcasts, almost always, I feel like the Holy Spirit in me brings someone to mind who would also love it. And so I just encourage my audience, as you are listening to the show, if God brings someone to your mind, please share it with them. And I don't mean it, because I've got to get I'm not monetizing my show anymore. That is not a goal for me now. It's really just, I'm putting this out here because I want people to learn and grow closer to God because of it. And, authors write books and they don't write a book so one or two people will read it. And I feel the same way about podcasting. We don't get on this mic and we don't put all this work in so 10 people will listen. We want lots of people to listen, and we believe that the message that God has given us is important. And so we have to ask people to share it.
Yeah.
So that's the number one way I say to grow your show. A second way I would say is just to be a guest on other shows. And again, this is not news to most of you listening, but even if you can go on a show that would be thrilled to have you, even if it's not a big show, it doesn't matter. We all know that it's easier to get a podcast listener. It's your exact audience. It's your exact audience. So getting them to want to listen to your show is probably the easiest way to get people to discover you.
Exactly. What would you say are some of the crucial pieces of hardware and software that you use to produce your podcast and those that you help produce at Lifeway?
Probably people think because I'm at Lifeway and we have a big studio and we have all the gear that I'm going to go, expensive here. I'm not. Because I told you, Tim, before we started recording, my favorite microphone is the Audio-Technica ATR 2100. I actually don't know if you can still get the 2100. I think you might have to get the 2300 now. I'm not sure.
Yeah, they updated it recently. Yeah, so it's
okay.
I can't remember I feel like there's another letter at the end now or something.
Yes, something like that. We'll link it in the show notes, right, Tim?
Yeah.
That is my favorite mic. Pat Flynn did a YouTube video years ago in 2017 probably, where he sampled a lot of different mics. And I watched that YouTube video. I liked the sound of the Audio-Technica mic the best, and that's how I chose it. And I have stuck with it. I have just switched to the Shure SM7B this year. Up until then, I was using the Audio-Technica mic, and I love it. Yeah. So if you have a more expensive mic, but you need a travel mic, like a USB travel mic, that Audio-Technica mic is the best one because it's a dynamic mic and it drowns out all the extraneous sound. So I love it. Yeah. So I would say that's my number one mic. For podcast productivity, my favorite productivity app is Trello.
Okay. Yeah.
Do people talk about Trello on here?
We haven't really talked about the workflow side of things and doing. So I started out using Trello for my business. Yeah. And then used Airtable, and then now I'm using Notion. Kind of just has evolved, but similar kind of a thing. But how do you use it? Yeah, I'd love to hear.
Yeah, I love Trello, and so especially with producing multiple shows, I have different Trello boards for every show, and then I have cards in Trello for every episode. And also like task lists, like, we use the paid version of Trello so that we can assign dates to task lists and assign them to people. So it does like all of the things Asana does, but it's just visually a little easier to wrap your brain around. I feel like Asana is homework. And so I know, like setting up the Asana board to me is just homework. I appreciate Trello and its simplicity. But I think that's interesting that you haven't talked about workflow, because I think workflow is one of the biggest challenges to podcasting. Getting in a good flow. In fact, that's probably the thing that I get the most questions about.
Okay.
In fact, I've got a meeting on the books next week with a friend who's starting a podcast who said, we need your help on workflow. And I was like, yes, you do. I understand. I remember the day. I needed it too. So it's hard.
It's stuff like that I tend to almost forget about because it's just the normal day-to-day stuff now, right? Like after you do it for so long, it's just, well, that's just how I do the work. But people that are getting started, we have an idea for an episode, and then what?
And then what?
Right, exactly. And then it's got to go, you need to know what topics you're talking about, bullet pointed at least or something, and then record it. And then what do you do after recording? You got to, go through all of the different post process. And if you're cutting social clips, there's other elements you need to do in there. So workflow is huge.
It's funny, Tim, because when people start their podcast, and part of my story is someone encouraged me, do one thing every day to follow that dream. One thing every day. And I was like, okay, I didn't even know what the one thing was. Like, I'm just going to figure out what my one thing is today to get me toward podcasting. Now, can you imagine just doing one thing? It's what you said. It's like, I forget that, there was a day where I was just doing one thing every day.
Yeah. Another question along these lines with the technical and production side of things. I noticed that you put a link at the top of your show notes, and I'm guessing it might be built into like a template. You can talk about that if you want, that says, send us a text message. And so I was intrigued by that. And when you tap on it, it just pops up in your texting app. And how have you found that to be a great communication method for your audience?
Okay, I love that you asked this question. So that is a feature that's provided by our media host, and we use Buzzsprout.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with Buzzsprout?
Yeah.
Okay, so Buzzsprout actually allows you just to turn that off or on if you want text messages. So it's brand new. I don't even know that I've gotten any text messages.
Okay.
I need to go back and check.
Yeah. Okay.
I know some of our other shows have gotten text messages, have turned that on because I see them pop up in my Buzzsprout emails. It's a really quick way for you to get audience feedback or for them to ask questions. You have to check back with me on it because we just turned it on. So I don't have a real good sample yet to know.
Yeah.
But isn't that cool?
That is neat. Yeah, because when you think about podcasting, there's not a great way to get feedback. I mean, people do the ratings and reviews, which is helpful, but episode-specific feedback would be more beneficial. And that's what Spotify's trying to do with commenting that they've added recently. And so that's a cool way that Buzzsprout is specifically doing it. Yeah, I'd be interested to know how that shapes out.
Well, check back. I'll let you know.
Yeah. All right. Well, what I do know about your show is that you are about to start season 2. And so I'd love to know, before we come to the high pass segment, what are you excited about for season 2 of the podcast?
So I'm super excited because season 2, I'm working on nailing down all my illuminators. I have 3 out of 4 already committed. I've already recorded with one of them. I won't reveal everything to your audience, but I will tell you that season 2 is all built around holy habits. So it's basically the spiritual disciplines.
Yeah.
It's Hosanna Wong calls the spiritual disciplines the trellis for the vine and the branches to grow and stay connected together. And so we're exploring that and what all those holy habits look like through season 2. One of my illuminators that I will tell you that I've already recorded with, her name is Dr. Elena Barron, and she is a spiritual director. And so it has been so refreshing to get her perspective on spiritual disciplines and holy habits. So I'm thrilled about it.
Yeah.
So excited.
That's great. All right, well, let's jump into the high pass segment where I ignore the lows and I ask you about some of your favorite things. So,
okay, awesome.
I know that you're in Orlando, so I'm guessing you go to Disney quite frequently. So what's your favorite park at Disney?
Magic Kingdom.
Magic Kingdom.
Listen, easy, no brainer. Yeah.
Nice. What's your favorite worship album lately?
Oh, yes. I knew you were going to ask me this. Okay, I don't know that I have an album, but my favorite song right now is Bless God. Do you know that one?
You know,
by Brooke?
I feel like I probably have heard it, but I could not tell you the lyrics right now.
Yeah, it's my favorite right now. So put it on and crank it up. It's so good.
Nice. All right. What's one of your favorite stories from a listener of how your podcast has impacted their life?
Well, I'll tell you a funny story, but I was with a good friend who is, I won't say her name, but she's a speaker and an author and much more well-known than me. Okay. And we were at an event and someone recognized her. This lady came over and recognized her. She was talking to her and, kind of fangirling a little bit. And she was like, oh my gosh, I just love your books and all of that. My friend turned to me and she said, have you met Angie Elkins? And I'm telling you, this woman freaked out. She did not see me standing there, but she had been a listener to my show. And I'm going to tell you, I don't have a ton of listeners. Like, I'm not one of the huge podcasters. But the fact that she even knew who I was, but not only that, shared with me like a specific time, something she was going through, and a specific episode that she listened to and how it really blessed her. And the fact that it was just like made her day to get to have a conversation with me.
That's cool.
I just walked away from that moment going, whose life is this? I do not understand how me sitting behind this microphone by myself can touch somebody in that circumstance. I mean, it's just mind-blowing. So yeah, that's the first thing that came to mind.
Nice. Yeah. All right. Well, as we close, I'd love to know, since you've been in podcasting for a while and you work with Lifeway and you worked with Jamie Ivey, who do you think would be a great guest for this podcast?
Oh, yeah. So do you know Crystal Hurst?
I don't.
Crystal Hurst is amazing. So you would know her family. Her sister is Priscilla Shire and her father's Tony Evans. Crystal has been in the podcasting game a long time, longer than me.
Okay.
She has a fantastic ministry and her podcast is so good. I actually used to edit her show.
Okay.
She was one of my clients back in the day.
Nice.
So I would recommend Crystal Hurst and I would recommend her show to anybody listening.
Great.
So good.
Nice. Well, Angie, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the podcast today, share your journey in podcasting over the past 7 years.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me. I want to say one more thing, Tim.
Yeah.
I want your audience to take a note from this. I'm going to embarrass you. Your preparation for this interview, it made me feel so seen and honored as a guest. I will tell you that I haven't done a ton of guesting, but I've done a lot of interviews, but I work with a lot of podcasters and I know what goes on behind the scenes to prep for interviews. Because I'm not a super well-known personality, I don't have a book out there, whatever, the fact that you did your homework and found out about my story and my podcasting journey and then invited me to come onto your show really made me feel seen and appreciated. And so I want every guest I have on my show to feel the way I felt coming on to your show. And I think that there is a gap. This is just a need that I've seen across podcasting. There is a gap between the podcast host and the podcast guest. And if we can all come to the table as if we are serving each other, I think that is the way to make our podcasts amazing. And you have modeled that so well. And I just want to make sure your audience knows that. So, Tim, if you have not done an episode on how to prep for an interview, have you done that?
No, I haven't. I've just been interviewing folks, so maybe we'll have to do that.
Yes, you should teach the course on how to prep for an interview. For sure. You did a great job.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I can't take credit for that. I've learned from the wonderful people at Ramsey and got to produce the Entre Leadership podcast and got to learn from some of the great folks there that were doing it before me, and I got to learn alongside them. And part of it too, why I feel like I put in so much work to it is because I worked with 5 different hosts over my the time at Ramsey. And so I had to basically prepare it as if I was almost as if I was doing it so that they could do it effectively because the hosts were doing so many other things as well. And so I'm glad that you enjoyed seeing the prep and that we got to have this conversation.
Yeah, I am too.
I really enjoyed my conversation with Angie and getting to hear her journey with both her own podcast and her podcasting career. She shared some great advice there for growing your podcast audience. First, create episodes that people want to share. Second, ask your audience to share it with somebody. And then third, be a guest on other shows. If you do those 3 things, you should start to see more people listening to your podcast. You can listen to Let It Shine with Angie Elkins with the link in the show notes. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Ministries That Podcast, produced by Sonomorphic. If you enjoyed today's episode, follow or subscribe to the podcast and share it with a friend. That's the best way to get the word out, so together we can help more ministries grow and thrive through podcasting. Now come back in 2 weeks to hear my conversation with Monica Swanson. She's a popular blogger, author of several parenting books, and the host of the Monica Swanson podcast. Monica and I are going to talk about her going from a personal coach and trainer to an author and podcaster, rebranding her show from Boy Mom to the Monica Swanson podcast, and the importance of an email list for podcasters. Well, until next time, keep encouraging your audience as they follow Jesus.